This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome to episode 37 of the Naked Mormonism podcast, the Serial Mormon History podcast. Today is Thursday, July 28th, 2016. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. Let's do a quick wrap-up of the last historical timeline episode for our serving of milk today, and then we'll move right into the meat of today's show. Last episode was a monster. It was like some 3.5 hours of history, and I bet it was a bit tough to get through the entire thing because there was just so much content. It was jam-packed. Today's episode is going to be a little bit shorter just for your listening pleasure. So last episode, we began with discussing where the church was and where its leadership stood. Joe, Hiram, Rigdon, and Ollie were all in Massachusetts looking for buried treasure, while the remaining leadership in Kirtland were plotting an assassination attempt against the prophet. When the argument got heated, Bloody Brigham Young and a guy named Jacob Bump nearly went down to blows over whether or not Joe was a real prophet or was led astray in some way. This was all in the wake of the Fanny Alger affair, happening only weeks after it was widely rumored in Kirtland that Joe and her were, getting a little busy in the barn behind Joe's Kirtland house. Dissent and murmuring was at an all-time high, and some people in the leadership of the church were plotting the overthrow of the powers that be. Luckily for Joe, Bloody Brigham had his back and came to the rescue. As quickly as he could, Brigham took Samuel Smith, who was Joe's younger brother, in a carriage ride to meet the group that was coming back from Massachusetts. Once they met up, Joe took Sam's spot on the carriage, and Brigham and Joe rushed back to Kirtland to put out the destructive fires of insurrection that were raging through the streets of Kirtland. Not all was well and good inside the highest leadership, though. Soon after this dissent was pacified for a short time, Rigdon and Ollie had a public dispute about the nature of God, splayed out in the Messenger and Advocate over November and December of 1836. Rigdon argued that God is a finite God made of flesh and bone, while Ollie argued that the traditional Trinitarian God of infinitude didn't have a body of flesh and bone. Now, while these didn't seem directly contradictory in the exact language when we read it, this was some kind of harbinger of how the church would begin changing in the coming years, with Rigdon rising to more prominence and beginning to dictate church policy and beliefs, while Ollie slowly faded away into apostasy. But more on that in shortly coming episodes. So those topics got us halfway through the last episode, while the final topic took the rest of the episode. We dove headfirst into the Kirtland Safety Society, or as it later came to be known, the Kirtland Safety Society Anti-Banking Company, and of course all of the insidious bullshit couched in the language of the Articles of Agreement for the foundation of the company. Unfortunately, I was unable to parse out a lot of the language in the articles, but luckily for all of us, Phil Ferguson of SkepticMoney.com, Polaris Financial Planning, and the host of The Phil Ferguson Show was kind enough to stop by on really short notice and lend his expertise, and that was great. Thanks again, Phil. With his help, we were able to understand just how fucked up the articles for establishing the Kirtland Safety Society Anti-Banking Company were, and why the articles were worded in the way that they were. The discussion with Phil took us to the end of the historical portion of last episode, which takes us to the end of the roundup of the last episode, filling us with the milk of today's episode. So let's dive into the meat and see how far into 1837 we can get without, getting the episode up to 3.5 hours. Let's try to keep it under that mark. So in this episode, we're going to start out with talking about the Safety Society Company absorbing the Oliver Cowdery Company printing press, expressing just how much power the Safety Society Company had. After that, we'll discuss the 1830 politics of the Whigs versus the Democrats and what that meant for the Mormons in Ohio and Missouri. And then to wrap up the show, we'll spend the last half discussing dissent in the church and just how fractioned everything was getting by the mid-1837. We may have even found the first possible coup attempt against Joe, but, who really knows for sure? It's kind of ambiguous and up to interpretation. But let's get into it. Here we are. So to get us started here, this is the meat of the episode. Let's officially close up 1836 and move into 1837. Now, the last episode, we kind of dipped our toe into January 2nd of 1837, but we only did that to read the Articles of Agreement for the Safety Society Company. We didn't officially close up 1836 and, get into 1837. So that's what we're going to do now. The final occurrence in 1836 that merits any mention is a baptism of somebody important in our timeline. Willard Richards, who was the cousin of Brigham Young, was baptized by Bloody Brigham on December 31st, 1836. Now, Willard Richards is a fascinating person and quite important to our timeline. His most notable achievement is most of what we read from the history of the church was written by him. Totaling nearly 1,900 of pages of history of Joseph Smith. All of the history of the church. That was Willard Richards. Also, Richards was the fourth man that was present on the day of the Carthage gunfight that ended in the deaths of Joseph and Hiram Smith. Now, just to kind of tease a little bit on that, the conspiracy theorists may claim that Richards was the first man who actually shot Joseph Smith, or maybe pulled the trigger on Hiram, who was the first man to go down in the Carthage shootout. But those are just conspiracy theories with no factual merit and no basis on any real evidence. We do know, however, that Richards was the only man in the room completely unscathed. He wasn't shot. Even though he's 400 pounds and has a forehead that you could play an IMAX movie on, making him the largest target by far. And a sizable meat shield at that. So how he didn't catch a single bullet seems kind of odd, right? Who knows what really happened that fateful day? That needs to be said, but we do know that Richards would go on to serve as second counselor to Bloody Brigham and be involved in one of the earliest treks out to Utah, serving there until his death in 1854. So luckily for Willard Richards, he's prominent enough in our timeline to give a proper name-o-nickname to. So we'll come to know the monstrous fat ass that is Willard Richards as Big Willie Dick, not to be confused with Crazy Willie, Joe's younger brother. Big Willie Dick was Bloody Brigham's cousin and a close associate to Brigham in the Utah years, and enters our timeline on December 31st, 1836. Welcome to the show, Big Willie. So that wraps up 1836 for us. So let's pry open 1837 and see what we can find hiding in this Pandora's box. The first thing that jumps out to us in 1837 is just how much capital and power the Anti-Banking Society began absorbing as soon as it was founded. Now, nearly all of the investors were members of the church, the vast majority of them being in leadership positions. They were paying in their own cash investments to buy shares in the company, and in return, they were issued notes from the company for promise of repayment. These notes are all over collector websites and eBay nowadays. You can pick them up for a hefty sum of a small fortune now. But in order to understand this absorption that we're talking about, we need to understand the firm of Oliver Cowdery Company. So in order to print the Messenger and Advocate as a for-profit venture, Joseph and the leadership incorporated the printing press as a separate company with Ollie at the head of it. It was incorporated as Oliver Cowdery Company as a subsidiary of Joseph's Church of the Latter-day Saints. This made it possible for Ollie's company to bill people for subscriptions to membership in the company, and then disseminate the Messenger and Advocate as the newsletter to the members of the company. It wasn't so much a newspaper agency as it was a club requiring membership with a monthly newsletter about church affairs. This is a passage out of the History of the Church, Volume 2, page 475, and it's describing what we're about to talk about. Quote, "The brethren in Missouri were very busy in gathering into Caldwell County, entering United States land, building houses, and preparing to put in crops in the spring. On the first day of February 1837, the firm of Oliver Cowdery Company was dissolved by mutual consent, and the entire establishment was transferred to Joseph Smith June and Sidney Rigdon, and Warren A. Cowdery acted as their agent in the printing office and book bindery and editor of the Messenger and Advocate. End quote. Now, alright, I'm not 100% sure how to interpret this, but it says that the company, Oliver Cowdery Company, was dissolved by mutual consent. Something that I don't think would merit mention unless the opposite were possibly true, right? So let's consider the possibilities of why Ollie's company was dissolved and transferred to Joe and Rigdon, while appointing Warren Cowdery, Ollie's brother, to be editor-in-chief of the Messenger and Advocate, which effectively stripped Ollie of any and all power, removing him from his post as editor-in-chief of the newspaper. Now, the first possibility or reason that this company was absorbed by the Safety Society Company was just, strictly business, right? That's the first thing that comes to mind. If Joe and Rigdon were trying to build the capital of the Safety Society Company, what better way to do so than to absorb a company that was already running in the black? No, I don't know if Oliver Cowdery Company was actually running in the black, but given the number of subscriptions that they must have had and the price each subscription fetched, it was probably the only company under the umbrella of the church that wasn't bleeding money. So the absorption of it into the Safety Society Company could have been just a business deal to raise the capital on the books of the Safety Society Anti-Banking Company, right? Well, the second possibility, or, the reason that it was absorbed that comes to mind is a little bit more sinister here. Now, keep in mind, this absorption happened merely a month after Ollie had published his treatise on the, epistemology of God that contradicted Rigdon's own treatise from the month prior. Joe obviously sided with Rigdon in this case instead of Ollie because the Mormon God from this time forward, 1837 on, would be a finite God of flesh and bone. Later on, of course, the idea of kolob and all that shit would come in too. But this is where the sinister part comes in, and, it's my own, naked perspective of the situation. So it might sound conspiratorial and whatnot, so take that for what it's worth, but it's my opinion that Rigdon didn't like Ollie's little contradiction in the December issue that came into conflict with his own treatise in the November issue of the paper, and Rigdon took it personally, as he was wont to do. Once Rigdon took it personally, he did whatever necessary to remove Ollie from a position where he could contradict Rigdon's influence on Joe ever again. So in reaction to Ollie's different opinions on God, Rigdon convinced Joe that Oliver Cowdery Company should be dissolved and absorbed into the Safety Society, while Ollie would be removed from editor-in-chief and replaced with his more obedient brother, Warren Cowdery. Keep in mind, this is 1837, and that's when we really start to see the break between Joe and Ollie, and I think that Rigdon had a lot to do with this fracturing of their friendship and the separation of Ollie's influence on Joe. But on the flip side, I suppose it could just strictly be a business move to make the books of the Safety Society Company look better. Anything is really possible, and there's probably multiple possibilities that aren't coming to my mind, but those are just the two that I thought of. I'm playing with thought experiments here. So like I said, that's just my opinion on why Ollie was removed. Just take that for what it's worth. I'm only basing that off of the personalities that I've constructed of these individuals in my own mind and trying to look at the big picture narrative to see how something like this business deal may have been influenced by other factors. People always say, business isn't personal. Oftentimes, things that happen in the business world are very personal, and I think we're seeing the effect of that right here. So, moving right along from that, there were still some powerful feelings of betrayal among the various members of Joe's, his cabinet, his closest advisors. So many of the apostles that had plotted to remove or kill Joe at the middle to end of 1836 while he was in Massachusetts still had that same ever-present negative feeling about Joe and his leadership, but they couldn't do anything while Joe had so many close allies in his ranks, right? We see this same thing happen with nearly any coup d'etat or usurpation, right? The leader tends to do things that his closest advisors dislike. Now, while this doesn't seem to pose any threat early on, the more the leader tends to do these more, radical and crazy things, the more the closest advisors tend to turn against him until he no longer has any loyal advisors or counselors and is finally overthrown. So in early 1837, there were still quite a few people close to Joe that were still on his side that wouldn't allow for an overthrow of the throne. Joe had to get a bit crazier in the Nauvoo years for the rest of his advisors to finally turn against him, but at this time in Kirtland, he still had plenty of allies that were watching his back, both in the leadership as well as just in the members of the church. Now, to be honest, the affair with Fanny kind of began the murmurings among the Quorum of the 12, if they weren't already there in the first place, and the establishment of the Safety Society Company seemed to make that echoing voice of dissent slightly louder. The next passage that we're going to read here is from the autobiography of Ebenezer Robinson, and I've used this autobiography for the past 3 historical episodes, so if you haven't read it yet, I will once again strongly recommend doing so. It's really a fantastic first-hand account of so many prominent occurrences in Mormon history, so once again, it will be linked in the show notes for this episode. So, one quick note before reading it. Robinson enlightens us to an amazing phenomenon of human nature when it comes to a leader of any given community. Joe was the leader of the Kirtland community and anybody else that professed belief in the Book of Mormon, which created many problems when people began to question the church. When somebody had the slightest inkling that Joe may be taking things the wrong direction or something, or that it might be leading the church incorrectly, that person would be seen as somebody that was questioning the dictates of Almighty God, and the person God chose to be his prophet over the church, Joseph Smith. Now this is where we run into some serious problems, because there's no possible way of thinking that Joe was a false prophet without saying that the entire religion is false, right? So when a member of the Quorum of the 12 or any other higher up in the church would question whether or not Joe was on the right path, they were inherently questioning everything about the church up to that point, implying damning levels of doubt for the entire leadership of the church. And that's where this becomes a critical problem. No person could question Joe's leadership or conduct without questioning the truth of his church, which brought them under a certain level of criticism, right? So, a doubter could voice their doubts and be seen as an outsider, or, be brought into a disciplinary council or whatever the case might be, or that person could internalize their doubts and continue to follow Joe until the tides shifted against him. In this excerpt that we're about to read, I think we begin to see this shifting of the tides against Joe and his conduct begin to finally take footing and possibly even gain some ground here. This is from Ebenezer Robinson, quote, "Heretofore there had been some individual church trials, which would naturally occur among a people as numerous as the church had become, and some individuals had denied the faith. There had not been any general dissension, however, but a universal oneness seemed to prevail until after the banking institution had been established. During the winter and spring of 1837, a great split occurred between a number of the leading elders of the church. Frederick G. Williams, Freddie G. Willie, one of the first presidency, Martin Harris, not so smarty Marty, D-Day David Whitmer, Luke and Leadfoot Lyman E. Johnson, P.Q. Parley Parker Pratt, William E. Professor Bill McClellan, John F. Boynton, the last 5 named were members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, Roger Orton, one of the 70, and a number of others, including S. Wilbur Denton, printer, a high priest, who testified of having seen a great vision during the times of washings and anointings the preceding March. These all objected to the course being pursued by Brother Joseph Smith, Jr. and the church, but we asked no particulars with regard to the matter, thinking that all things would be reconciled in a short time, and church matters move along as heretofore. One thing we felt sure of, the gospel was true, and that truth and righteousness would ultimately prevail, the saints be gathered, Zion redeemed and established in everlasting strength, and we believed the church was the medium through which the glorious result would be brought about. Therefore, looked upon all who opposed or who did not agree with Joseph Smith Jr. and the church as weak in the faith, or dissenters from the faith. But the disaffection continued and, if anything, grew stronger." End quote. That list was no small list of names of nothing but prominent leaders in the church and the Quorum of the 12 or 70s or whatever that had doubts about Joe, his leadership, and his church as a whole. Now, last episode, we kind of saw the beginning of Joe becoming a mob boss. This episode, we begin to see the tides of loyalty shift against Joe. If not for Defection Day in the following year of 1838, in my opinion, the church never would have survived. We'll talk about that when it comes up in the next couple of historical episodes, because it'll take an entire episode to cover just the tribunals and excommunications that happened in that year. But suffice it to say, murmurings were running rampant throughout the highest leaders in the church, all while Joe was somewhat insulated from the dissent, foremost by Hinchpin Rigdon and subsequently by Hiram, Big Daddy Cheese, Bloody Brigham, and a few other members that were still continuing to be loyal to Joe. And I think it is worth pointing out as well, Ebenezer Robinson does say that they were very sure that the gospel was true and that, truth and righteousness would ultimately prevail, and that any of these matters would be sorted out in the future. And, they weren't actually damning to the church in and of itself. But he does close it up with the disaffection continued and, if anything, grew stronger. That's the point we need to get at. And that's what's so important to talk about is this isn't something that just went away. These weren't problems that eventually just sort of evaporated. They started to snowball and get worse and worse as time progressed, as Joe did more and more crazy shit. So it's an ever-present issue and pressure that we need to keep our eye on and keep in mind, because come 1838, we have a lot to discuss with Defection Day, with this huge day of dissent where so many people break off of the church. But that's coming up in the near future. I don't want to talk too much about it right now, because there's something a little more important to talk about right now, and that's politics, right? It's not current politics. I do like to discuss current politics. I often want to do it, but politics that were relevant to our timeline are much more important here. Now, to describe it, the majority of the northern states Mormons that were living in Ohio and Missouri identified with the Democratic Party. Now, just in my research of 1830s politics, it's hard to try and provide analogs to today's politics in, trying to describe the politics back then. But basically, the way that I see it, and please, if anybody understands this much better than me, I'm sure you're out there, please send me an email and describe this in a way that's more palpable to me. But the way that I describe it, the Democrats were kind of like the established party, while the Whigs were the up-and-coming party, right? During the hotly contested 1836 election, the Whigs put forward 4 nominees to try and deny Martin Van Buren the Electoral College votes necessary to get elected. Now, of the necessary 148 votes to win, Martin Van Buren pulled in 170, which was a solid victory for the Democrats, but only because of the Electoral College. Even in the 1830s, the Electoral College was kind of showing its age and its, ill-adept capabilities of dealing with real-life politics, because the state of Pennsylvania came up 4,200 votes short of going Whig instead of Democrat, which would have switched the election in the favor of the Whig Party had those 4,200 votes been different. So here we begin to see political turmoil largely affect our timeline if it hasn't done so up to this point. Now, before now, the largest sticking point against the Mormons was their abolitionist members that were living in Missouri, the northernmost slave state. That's a very hotly contested political topic that Joseph even had to weigh in on multiple times throughout his leadership. Now, this was, abolitionism versus slave ownership was the driving force behind the Missourians in independence chasing the Mormons out of Jackson County, forcing them to settle in Clay and Caldwell counties, the town of Far West being the most primary town of settlement. Missouri was undoubtedly a contentious place for Mormons to live. But we can't neglect to discuss the politics of Kirtland and the so-called persecution that was happening there. Now, the vast majority of the electorate living in Ohio were members of the newly founded Whig Party, disliking the previous Democratic rule of Andrew Jackson. And while the vast majority of Mormons were Democrats from the Upper East Coast and New England area, right? Now, in all of my research, like I said, I haven't been able to find like a proper analog to today's politics to make it feel more relevant, right? But to put it simply, it was just this bipartisan system where the Whigs were more for like improving the land that we already had and, promoting states' rights and stuff, while the Democrats were more geared towards expansionism into Canada and the Western territories, even if it meant war. They were promoting egalitarianism and big government and, of course, American exceptionalism. Andrew Jackson, who had just left office in 1836, was a Democrat, having been labeled as King Andrew by the Whigs. And that was one of the most prominent taglines against Andrew Jackson was he was, King Andrew, the Masonic, upperclassman and slave owner, right? And so he was succeeded by Martin Van Buren, who was another Democrat in the 1836 election. Ohio was a Whig state. And they didn't like all of these Democratic Mormons moving into Kirtland and fucking with their election numbers. What I'm about to read is from the Encyclopedia of Mormonism, hosted on eom.byu.edu. And there will be a link to it in the show notes. This is something that's hosted on BYU's servers, the Encyclopedia of Mormonism. It's kind of hard to argue that this is, anti-Mormon literature or whatever. But it discusses the politics of the area quite well. We're going to read a couple passages here from it. Quote, "Some of the non-Mormon residents consider the intrusion of Latter-day Saints into the community a threat to their traditional pattern of living. Some complained that the Mormon practice of living in harmony with revelations recorded by a prophet was hostile to the American spirit of democracy. Residents not only rejected LDS beliefs regarding visions, revelations, and the restoration, but also claimed that the Latter-day Saints had increased the poverty of the community and were a political and economic threat." End quote. All right, let me just pause right there for a second because that is completely true. Now, whether or not the people were appalled at the Mormons living by the dictates of a cult leader, I think that had very little to do with it, but the last part where it said the Ohio residents claiming the Mormons had increased the poverty of the community and were a political and economic threat, that couldn't be closer to the truth. Many of these Mormons were living on land that had been purchased by the church, which was consistently defaulting on its loans, and it wasn't paying its debts. The people weren't paying their own debts. These people, for all intents and purposes, were squatters on church-owned land that the church wasn't paying for. These people were extremely poor, and the people that owned land next to them that were non-Mormons were suffering land depreciation because of the Mormons' shitty real estate practices and financially destitute followers. The non-Mormon people in Ohio and Missouri were pretty fed up with all of this bullshit that the Mormons were doing and would soon do something about it, but we'll get to that soon. So continuing on from the same Encyclopedia of Mormonism article, quote, "The political competition reached a peak in 1837 when Latter-day Saints were elected to all local township offices except for the office of constable. Prior to that year, only 4 Latter-day Saints had been elected to a major office, and there had been a tendency for the citizens to re-elect the earliest settlers. In addition to gaining control of the local government, Latter-day Saints transformed the township's voting pattern from Whig to Democrat. Since Kirtland was located in a Whig section of Ohio, and all townships in Geauga County in the mid-1830s except Kirtland supported that party, Whigs in northeastern Ohio united in opposition to the Mormons. Complaints and charges escalated into threats and mob action." End quote. So now we begin to see this political sphere collapse on the Mormons. They could feel the tensions rising, and the threats to them weren't idle. Small contingencies of Mormons were moving out to Clay and Caldwell counties in Missouri from Kirtland because the Mormons were able to settle there in relative peace. But nearly anywhere that Mormons settled, they slowly drew the ire of non-Mormon locals. Whether it was in Missouri, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, it didn't matter. We can look at the politics of the area and understand, how violence could rise up with just the opposition to the political beliefs of the Mormons. But that doesn't tell the whole story, right? We can also look at the fact that the Mormons were inviting slaves in Missouri to come to church, and they were also inviting free African Americans to join the church and move to Missouri. The slang word for them was often mulattoes. If the slaves in Missouri were able to see free black people going to Mormon church all the time, of course, learning how to read by reading the Book of Mormon, those slaves would undoubtedly want to join in, seeing that better life. The grass is greener on the other side, which could effectively incite an uprising of slaves against the slave owners of Missouri, right? This possibility terrified the slave owners. The fear of a slave uprising was one of the main forces driving violence against the Mormons in Missouri. Add in the pressure of Mormons taking over politics in Kirtland and in Missouri, and of course holding the majority of offices in Kirtland and, the newly settled Clay and Caldwell counties, we're beginning to see some very dark pieces of the Mormon persecution puzzle fall into place here. Now, of course, the money problem of the Mormons didn't help the situation at all. So many of them were incredibly poor, and Joe was always putting stricter monetary demands for membership on the existing members, so they had no way of, amassing personal wealth or getting out of the hole that Joe was constantly digging on their feet. Mormons, sort of carried a stigma. They were known as the dregs of society, illiterate, poor, dirty, and morally corrupt in their business dealings, spurring some very hard stereotypes against the Mormons that the majority of non-Mormons began to hold against them in typical human fashion. Now, all of these pressures relating to politics, slaves, money, everything, they all had dramatic effects with people mobbing against the Mormons. But we also can't ignore the religious pressures that added a lot of negativity to the equation. The Mormons were outsiders, no doubt about that. I mean, they believed the Bible to be insufficient for salvation, which was antithetical to so many believing Christians. Mormons, held their own views of their own God, championing their proprietary religious text as true scripture, so on and so forth. The Mormons, in all honesty, weren't much crazier than any other religion that cropped up out of the burned over district, but where the biggest problem arose when it came to religious disagreements was from Joseph Smith. He claimed to be enlightened, just as the prophets of the Old Testament, right? He claimed that he could commune with spirits and angels on high. He spoke with God and Jesus as two separate beings floating above him in the air at the age of 14, a story that had changed multiple times by this point. Joe claimed that he could heal people with laying on of hands that failed as often as it succeeded. As we read in the newspaper articles published about Mormonism in last episode, right? Joe claimed his people could speak in the Adamic languages and, speak in tongues, and they could experience the ministering of angels, possibly with the help of anointing oil, right? Joe claimed to know what God wanted his followers to do, and it usually involved giving Joe money. I think that the 1833 manifesto that was published in Missouri against the Mormons after the destruction of the printing press for the Evening and Morning Star sums up what we're talking about right now. Now, this is 1833. This is quite a few episodes back. But it's relevant to bring up now when we're talking about this persecution against the Mormons. And this is from the 1833 manifesto. I just pulled this from the Wikipedia page when I Googled the 1838 Mormon extermination order. And quote, "It is more than 2 years since the first of these fanatics or knaves, for one or the other they undoubtedly are, made their first appearance among us, and pretended as they did and now do to hold personal communication and converse face to face with the Most High God, to receive communications and revelations direct from heaven, to heal the sick by laying on hands, and, in short, to perform all the wonder-working miracles wrought by the inspired apostles and prophets of old." This is just 3 years after the church was founded, and these stereotypes were already taking hold, and Missourians were hating the Mormons because of these things that we're talking about here. It goes on, and it really does talk about what we're discussing here with this religious persecution. "They openly blaspheme the Most High God and cast contempt on his holy religion by pretending to receive revelations direct from heaven, by pretending to speak unknown tongues by direct inspiration, and by diverse pretenses derogatory to God and religion, and to the utter subversion of human reason. They declare openly that their God hath given them this country of land," Zion, independence, "and that sooner or later they must and will have possession of our lands for inheritance. And, in fine, they have conducted themselves on many other occasions in such a manner that we believe it a duty we owe to ourselves, our wives and children, to the cause of public morals, to remove them from among us. and we are not prepared to give up our pleasant places and goodly possessions to them, or to receive into the bosom of our families as fit companions for wives and daughters the degraded and corrupted free Negroes and mulattoes that are now invited to settle among us." End quote. So that was a diatribe published against the Mormons in the 1833 newspaper right before they were chased out of Independence and forced to move to Clay and Caldwell counties in Missouri, right? Everything listed there in 1833 was still going on in 1836, only to a much greater extent than it was 3 years prior. Mormons were gaining a great deal of notoriety as the biggest cult in the area, coming to take away your slaves and to preach to your family teachings from the devil and all that shit that we just read from that 1833 treatise. The persecution narrative ran rampant throughout Mormon communities, and we can understand that it wasn't particularly a persecution complex, it was a persecution reality. Granted, the Mormons did and were everything that the persecutors used to justify the persecution. I mean, not a single claim in that quote from before was inaccurate, but undoubtedly, persecution was a very harsh reality that the Mormons had to deal with, and I can't possibly overstate this enough. Now, add into the persecution they were dealing with, the level of apostasy in 1837 was beginning to become a real issue as well, which we're going to talk about in a minute here. But people leaving the church and calling it heresy was understandable, especially when many of the church council meetings involved sermons like this, taken from the History of the Church, Volume 2, page 479 through 480. Quote, "At 4 p.m., President Hiram Smith addressed the assembly, principally in relation to the temporal affairs of the church," temporal affairs always meaning money, "and censured those who counseled such brethren as moved to this place when they were not authorized to give advice. He also alluded, in terms of disapprobation, to the practice of some individuals in getting money from brethren that come in, when it ought to be appropriated to the discharge of heavy debts that are now hanging over the heads of the church, or for the payments of the land contracts which have been made for the benefit of the saints in this place." So Hiram Smith got up on the stand and said, "You guys are using your money wrong. You should be giving all of us your money. These are the temporal affairs of the church, and we'll be paying down the heavy debts that are hanging over the heads of the church." Next, it goes on to say, 25 minutes before 5, President Oliver Cowdery spoke, opposing the ideas of elders attempting to preach or teach that which they did not know, etc. So that was a talk that Oliver Cowdery gave that had some substance to it, and that was all we read about it. Whereas the thing about Hiram Smith is, 8 lines long, and it's talking about the temporal affairs and the lack of money that the church has. Whereas, this thing about Oliver Cowdery with actual teachings of the church was 1 line long. The next one that it talks about, the next paragraph is, President Sidney Rigdon rose a little before 5 p.m., and after referring to the gathering and to preaching of the gospel as the first things, alluded to the debt which had been contracted for building the Lord's house and other purposes, and stated 3 principal items that constituted nearly the aggregate of debt that now remained unliquidated. So now it goes on to say more issues with money with the church. And this is kind of important with what it discusses here with the next couple of paragraphs here. I'm just going to keep reading. First, a charge of $6,000 was appropriated and expended in consequence of the brethren being driven by a lawless mob from their possessions in Jackson County. The second was the building of the Lord's house, the unliquidated debt of which was rising of $13,000. The third item of debt was for the purchase of land, that there might be a place of rest, a place of safety, a place that the saints might lawfully call their own. All this is to lay a foundation for the gathering of Israel, and when the elders go abroad they can speak understandingly and urge the necessity and propriety of the gathering, from the fact that we have a place for them, and it is the will of God that they should come. So basically it says there, the reason that we have so much debt is because we paid $6,000 for all kinds of random shit, right? And for the people that were expelled from Jackson County and taken away from their possessions. Then $13,000 went, we still have $13,000 of debt for building the Lord's house. And then an undefined amount went to purchasing new lands in Missouri so we can have a place of salvation, we can have Zion. That's what it's talking about there. But it goes on to say, pray not upon one another, brethren, and for the time being say not, pay me what thou owest, but contribute all in your power to discharge the great debts that now hang over the church. So basically, don't pay your debts, pay the church everything that you have. And then the next line is a very interesting one. It says, at 5:30, bread and water were distributed liberally among the quorums, and it was truly a refreshing season to spirit and body. End quote. So this is what typical church meetings were like at this time. They were chastising every member for preaching false doctrine and then telling them to not be so greedy with their money, all while asking for more money to pay back the church's accrued debts. Now, that second to last line that we read told the people not to prey on each other and don't worry about collecting debts that you have among yourselves. Instead, just give every last penny that you have to discharge the great debts that now hang over the church. Now, another thing that's important to point out there was the last line that I read there. It's important for an interesting reason, and I think it's symptomatic of a larger problem. This was the first time in recorded Mormon history that we see them using water instead of wine for the sacrament ceremony in church. The revelation was given back in 1830 that, it doesn't matter what you use for the sacrament as long as you do so with an eye single to the glory of God, right? And at that time, Joe and Ollie used water, but that was only when they were just baptizing their wives into the church. It wasn't for the entire congregation like this was. So, 1837, that's when this happened. Having learned that, a good question to ask Mormons today is, why don't they use wine now instead of water for the sacrament ceremony? Now, if that Mormon is knowledgeable about Mormon history, they'll pull out the 1830 revelation that says, it doesn't matter what you use as long as you do so with an eye single glory to the glory of God, right? But if they don't know anything about Mormon history, they'll just say, because the word of wisdom commands us not to drink alcohol, even though that's never explicitly stated anywhere in the word of wisdom, right? The only logical question that follows is, why then, if we revere Joseph Smith as the prophet of the Restoration and venerate the leadership as infallible and enlightened by God, why did they only use wine for the first 7 years of the sacrament ceremony? It took them 7 years to adapt the use of water instead of wine for the ceremony. Why did it change, and why doesn't the church use wine today? Now, the correct answer to all of those questions is the same answer to why the church back then did so many things, and why the church does so many things today. Money. Joe's church was low on money, so they cut costs by not buying wine for everybody to drink during the sacrament ritual. The church today would need to spend millions a year on wine if it upheld this practice, so they just used tap water instead. Now, to go a step further, the Mormon church today even requires that the people that are setting up the sacrament tables, the little 14, 15-year-old teachers doing that, they have to bring their own bread from home. The church refuses to buy the fucking bread for the sacrament ceremony. It's just whatever bread that 14-year-old teacher can find in his pantry that Sunday. It's interesting how money was and still is the driving factor behind every decision the church makes, hearkening back to the good old days of Joe and Rigdon in charge. What's even crazier is the context in which these sermons were preached. This is from the previous page in the History of the Church, Volume 2, and we can find this passage, quote, "Therefore, in viewing the church as a whole, we may strictly denominate it one priesthood. President Smith also said," so this is what Joe said before Hiram, Ollie, and Rigdon got up on the stand and talked about money. This is what Joe said, "I frequently rebuke and admonish my brethren, and that because I love them. Not because I wish to incur their displeasure or mar their happiness." What an asshole. "Such a course of conduct is not calculated to gain the goodwill of all, but rather the ill will of many. Therefore, the situation in which I stand is an important one. So, you see, brethren, the higher the authority, the greater the difficulty of the station. But these rebukes and admonitions become necessary. from the perverseness of the brethren for their temporal as well as their spiritual welfare. End quote. What a dick, right? I mean, he's kind of on the cusp of being a self-aware dick, but he just barely missed the mark, right? He says that he has to rebuke and admonish the members of the church because they are perverse, even though he knows that it engenders ill will and mars their happiness. He knows how much of a dick he's being, but he claims that he has to be a dick because God needs him to be a dick, because the higher the authority, the greater the difficulty of the station, right? That's like a dick squared. That's a power dick right there. Especially when all that he talks about is needing more money and how righteous he and Rigdon are as leaders of the church, right? The next part of that passage is fucking golden, because Joe goes on to tell them about how hard he has it as a prophet, always having to rebuke the members and chastise them, and how much he would prefer to do any other job in the church. This is continuing from where we left off in the previous passage. Quote, "They actually constitute a part of the duties of my station and calling. Others have duties to perform that are important and far more enviable, and may be just as good, like the feet and the hands in their relation to the human body. Neither can claim priority or say to the other, I have no need of you. After all has been said, the greatest and most important duty is to preach the gospel." End quote. Now, this is just where Joe sounds like a dick in triplicate, right? He said that the job of prophet is way tougher than that of a missionary, and being a missionary in a foreign land is enviable over his own position as CEO of Mormon Inc. He says blatantly that preaching the gospel is the greatest and most important duty in the church, which is just like telling your sales force that they have the best job in the company and, the company wouldn't function without them. While the latter part of that statement is true, no company that makes a product can survive without a sales force, which applies to churches and missionaries. The former part, claiming that the salesmen have the best part of the job or have the best job in the church, is a fat load of grade A bullshit. After this, though, Joe cranks it up and goes into quadra-force dick mode, claiming that he had it so hard as an early missionary and the current missionaries have it so easy. Quote, from where we left off, "There are many causes of embarrassment of a pecuniary nature now pressing upon the heads of the church. They began poor, were needy, destitute, and were truly afflicted by their enemies. Yet the Lord commanded them to go forth and preach the gospel, to sacrifice their time, their talents, their good name, and jeopardize their lives. And, in addition to this, they were to build a house for the Lord and prepare for the gathering of the saints." Back in the good old days, they had it really tough back then. "Thus it is easy to see this must have involved them in financial difficulties." Oh, that's what did it? That's what was the financial difficulties, not your stupid fucking choices when it comes to money. "They had no temporal means in the beginning commensurate with such an undertaking, but this work must be done. This place had to be built up," meaning Kirtland. End quote. All right, premium dick right there, right? That's the ultimate dick. He just claimed that he had it so rough, and the members of the early church had it so rough, but still did what God told them to do, which is just such bullshit. Joe never lifted a fucking finger. He was always responsible for dictating shit from the pulpit, and his underlings would do the actual work necessary to make his commands come to life. Yes, he was persecuted and he put his life in jeopardy many times, but not much more than he ever did as a seer hunting for buried treasure. He just had more people following his whims once the church started, and had less of an excuse for fucking up his revelations as opposed to when he was just hunting for buried treasure, because these revelations were from God, right? But the next passage is where we begin to see the formation of Joe's entire point to this diatribe, to this screed. And it helps to explain the next thing that happens in the timeline. Basically, he was calling for the members to pay for the contracts the church had entered into, which is nothing new, but there's one detail that leads us into the next chapter of the history of the church, volume 2. Quote, "Large contracts have been entered into for lands on all sides, where our enemies have signed away their rights. We are indebted to them." That's honest. "But our brethren from abroad have only to come with their money, take the contracts, relieve their brethren from the pecuniary embarrassments under which they now labor, and procure from themselves a peaceable place of rest among us. This place must and will be built up, and every brother that will take hold and help secure and discharge those debts that have been made shall be rich." End quote. Did you catch that? It said, we are indebted to our enemies for the contracts we've entered into. That's important, right? At least he's coming by it honestly. We signed these contracts. We're in debt to these people. But our brethren from abroad have only to come with their money and relieve their brethren from the pecuniary embarrassments under which they labor. Joe was doing what every organism needs to do in order to survive: expand and acquire new resources, or the church would shrivel up and die. What Joe just said with the brethren from abroad is the first hint at the organization of the first large missionary force to the United Kingdom, specifically to Liverpool in Britain. Joe was hoping that the missionaries would preach to a bunch of rich people in Britain, spurring them to convert and travel across the seas with all of their wealth, and then they would give their wealth to the church to get the church out of debt, as long as the church had a place for them to rest, which was Zion. And we'll have to pick up on the British mission next episode, because, as I was looking into it, there's a lot of information there and a lot of important names to cover when it came to this missionary expedition. So we're going to ignore that for now. We'll pick it up at the beginning of next episode. But to round out the historical portion of today's episode, we need to discuss a court proceeding. Another one, right? I know that oftentimes the episodes are filled with, half of the episode will be something like a court proceeding or reading a legal document, but it's important to understand everything that's couched in these documents and to interpret exactly what it means in a way that makes sense to the historical context that we're reading into here. So before talking about this, I have to admit, I'm pretty confused. I'm not sure how to make heads or tails of this whole thing that happened here, but it seems important to kind of point out an overarching theme here before diving into the actual court document here. There was a fair amount of dissent going on throughout the church by April 1837 when this court proceeding happened. I've remarked about it many times by now, and not only in this episode, but in nearly every historical episode up to this point, right? Dissent was a constant pressure weighing on Joe and Rigdon since the beginning of the church. The dissent that we're about to discuss regards the church in Missouri under the Whitmer leadership. Now, Far West was the gathering point for the majority of the Missouri Mormons by the time 1838 rolls around. It was, like 5,000 people strong. It was a pretty sizable community. John Goebbels and D-Day David Whitmer were responsible for a large portion of ecclesiastical duties in Missouri, with people like, P. Cubed, Parley P. Pratt, and Edward Partyboy Partridge, and Freddie G. Willey, and Leadfoot Lyman Johnson, and Warren Parrish overseeing other necessary duties for keeping the church up and running in Missouri. From what I can gather, the Missouri churches were being run completely separately from the Kirtland Church. It's crazy. There was this 800-mile wedge of prairies between the two congregations of Missouri and Kirtland, and the Missouri churches couldn't be directly supervised by Joe or Rigdon. They didn't exactly have phone calls at the time, right? Without this level of oversight, anything could happen, and anybody could begin to see themselves as the proper church authority in the area, even to the point of not adhering to the will of the Kirtland Church, where headquarters was at, right? So to get this started out, on April 3rd of 1837, a High Council meeting was held in Far West, and they read a letter that was sent over from HQ in Kirtland. And this is the letter, and it lists out the complaints, basically. Quote, "Minutes of the High Council at Far West, at a meeting of the High Council in Far West, April 3rd, 1837. 7 of the standing councilors were present. John Murdoch was appointed moderator and Elias Higby clerk. Resolved that the council requests the presidents William Wines Phelps, W.W. Phelps, and John Goebbels Whitmer to give explanation of the following items." This is their list of 9 complaints that the headquarters Kirtland Church had with the Far West churches that were being led by W.W. Phelps and John and D-Day David Whitmer. First, by what authority was this place, meaning Far West, pointed out as a city and a place for a house of the Lord, and by whom? Second, by what authority was a committee appointed and ordained to superintend the building of the house of the Lord? Third, by what authority was Jacob Whitmer ordained to the high priesthood? Fourth, have two presidents authority to lay out a city and build a house of God, independent of the council of the high council, meaning the Kirtland Council? Fifth, by what authority was one of the high counselors disfellowshipped in the name of the high council without their knowledge? Of course, high council, once again, referring to Kirtland. Sixth, has any individual or individuals a right to prefer a charge to the presidency in Kirtland against any high counselor without the knowledge of the council or the individual? Seventh, should not the high council and bishop of Zion, who are appointed to do business for Zion, receive their inheritance in the care of that city in preference to one who is not particularly called to labor for Zion or an unbeliever? 8. Shall any intelligence relative to the building up of Zion be withheld from the Council of Zion? 9th, are the two presidents entitled to the profits arising from the sale of land on which the city is to be built in this place, independent of the authorities who have been appointed to labor with them for Zion and have suffered like tribulations with them? So those are the 9 complaints. Basically wondering by what authority the church was being run out in Far West. There was all kinds of things going on that the High Council in Kirtland did not agree with that the Far West church was doing, and they were calling them under ecclesiastical questioning to see exactly what the hell was going on out there. So the end of the letter goes, the council then agreed to invite Presidents W.W. Phelps and John Whitmer, also the Bishop Edward Partridge, and his counselors, also the 2 apostles, Thomas B. Marsh and David W. Patton, to meet with them on the 5th instance, that the above-named presidents might explain or answer the foregoing questions, and that the subject might be investigated. The council then adjourned to the 5th at 10 o'clock, Far West, April 5th, 1837, end quote. Now we are familiar with some of the charges that were raised against the leadership in Far West, and after 3 days of deliberation among themselves, they were finally summoned to headquarters in Kirtland to basically stand trial. They arrived near the end of May. That was just customary when you're traveling 800 miles. That's how long it takes. And this is where things really kick off with Hinchpin Rigdon leading this witch hunt against these possible dissenters. And this is just continuing on from the History of the Church, Volume 2. Quote, President Rigdon then read the following complaint. To the Presidency of the Church of the Latter-day Saints. We, the undersigned, feeling ourselves aggrieved with the conduct of Presidents David Whitmer and Frederick G. Williams, and also with Elders Lyman E. Johnson, Parley P. Pratt, and Warren Parrish, believing that their course for some time past has been injurious to the Church of God, in which they are high officers, we therefore desire that the High Council of Kirtland should be assembled, and we should have an investigation of their behavior, believing it to be unworthy of their high calling, all of which we respectfully submit. And then it has the people that are submitting the complaint, signed Kirtland, May 1837. So that was the official complaint that was filed by these people, and it was read out by Hinchpin Rigdon in this court proceeding to basically kick it off. So the next thing that I'm going to read is really long and actually pretty stupid. So I'm going to read it quickly. To give you an idea of what you're about to hear, basically the court hearing began with discussing whether or not the court had justification or authority to judge the people called into question. And that's pretty much it. There isn't any actual putting forth of evidence or discussion of witnesses or anything concerning actual issues. The entire court is spent deciding whether or not the High Council in Kirtland has the authority to judge and punish these guys that were supposedly leading an insurrection in the Far West churches. So that's why I'm going to read through it quickly. Just so you can hear the kind of argument that was going on and understand just how pointless this was. However, there is an overall point that I want to get to, so, kind of hang in there while we grind through this here. Quote, Elder Warren Parrish then stated that the declaration just read was not in accordance with the copy which they, the accused, received of the charges preferred against them. Which, that is true, right? What we just now read out by Sidney Rigdon, had nothing to do with the 9 complaints that were read earlier from the history, right? I mean, that simple as that. That was the problem, is like, oh, you said that we were coming here to answer for these 9 charges, and, nothing of what you just now said has anything to do with those charges. It goes on. The resolution was then offered and carried that 3 spoke on a side. The council was then opened by prayer by Sidney Rigdon. President Rigdon, sorry. After a short address to the councilors by President Rigdon, President Frederick G. Williams, Freddie G. Willie, arose and wished to know by what authority he was called before the present council, that according to the Book of Covenants, he ought to be tried before the bishop's court. After some discussion between Presidents Rigdon and Williams, President Rigdon gave his decision that President Williams should be tried before the present council. So, Freddie G. Willie got overruled by President Rigdon because President Rigdon was presiding. Next line. President David Whitmer also objected to being tried before the present council. President Williams then expressed a willingness to be tried for his conduct, and if this was the proper tribunal, he would be tried before it, but still thought it was not. So, President Williams and President Whitmer, David Whitmer, so Freddie G. Willie and D-Day David were saying, you don't have the authority to do this. And Rigdon is like, overruled. I do have the authority. Fuck you. Next line. President David Whitmer objected to being tried before the present council, stating that he thought the instructions in the Book of Covenants showed that this was not the proper authority to try him. Councilor Green, I'm not sure who Green is, gave it as his opinion that the present council was the proper authority to try President Williams and Whitmer. President Rigdon then submitted the case to the councilors. Councilor John Smith then put the question to the council for decision in substance as follows. Have the present council authority from the Book of Covenants to try Presidents Williams and Whitmer? So they're like, we do have the authority. Now let's put this question to the council. Do we have the authority to do it? It's so fucking stupid. A majority of the council decided that they could not conscientiously proceed to try Presidents Williams and Whitmer, and they were accordingly discharged. So anybody that disagreed on the council, you can just leave. After 1 hour's adjournment, the council sat again at 1:00 p.m. Sidney Rigdon and Oliver Cowdery presiding. All right, so we brought in Ollie Cowdung here as well as Hinchpin Rigdon. Councilor John Smith stated that he had selected 3 high priests to sit in the council to fill vacancies. So the people that were saying that they don't have the authority to do it, they removed them and brought in 5 people from the High Priest Council that would agree that they have the authority to do it. It's a fucking kangaroo court here. And asked the council if they accepted the selections he had made. Council decided in the affirmative. On motion of Warren Parrish, the councilors were directed to sit as they were originally chosen, or according to the form in the Book of Doctrine and Covenants as far as possible. Resolved that 3 speak on each side. Councilor Martin Harris moved that President Frederick G. Williams take a seat with the presidents. That makes sense. After much discussion as to the propriety of his sitting, motion carried and President Williams took his seat. So they're just like, you should sit over there, not with the councilors. You should sit with the presidents. Okay, great. And everybody voted on it, and he did. That's so stupid. Elder Parley P. Pratt, P cubed, then arose and objected to being tried by President Rigdon or Joseph Smith Jr. in consequence of their having previously expressed their opinion against him, stating also that he could bring evidence to prove what he then said. So P cubed stood up and was like, hey, I can't be tried by Rigdon or Joe because I have, I've expressed an opinion against these guys, and they are going to judge in the negative for me, right? So then it goes on. President Rigdon then stated that he had previously expressed his mind respecting the conduct of Elder Pratt, and that he had felt and said that Elder Pratt had done wrong, and he still thought so, and left it with the council to decide whether, under such circumstances, he should proceed to try the case. So Rigdon, who was presiding over the thing, over the council, was like, Pratt did say that we were doing something wrong, but that's because he was wrong. Do you agree with me, council? Amazing. Next line. After much discussion between the councilors and parties, President Rigdon said that under the present circumstances, he could not conscientiously proceed to try the case, and after a few remarks, left the stand. After all of that, Rigdon was finally like, okay, I guess I don't have the authority to do this. President Oliver Cowdery then said that although he might not be called upon to preside, yet if he should be, he should also be unfit to judge the case, as he had previously expressed his opinion respecting the conduct of Elder Parley P. Pratt and others, and left the stand. So he was like, yeah, I've also spoken out against P cubed here, so I'm not fit to be a judge on here either. Then we have President Williams then arose and said that as he had been implicated with the accused, he should be unwilling to preside in the case, and left the stand. So it went down the list of the proper people that were, the pecking order of authority here. And it went all the way down to, Oliver Cowdery was like, I can't preside. Rigdon was like, I can't preside. And then Freddie G. Willie was like, this court is against me. I obviously can't preside in it. It's so fucking stupid. So stupid. And then the final line in this is, the council and assembly then dispersed in confusion. Signed F.W. Cowdery, who was the clerk. End quote. It's so dumb. That was the entire court proceeding from what I could tell. Like, that's it. The council ended in complete confusion and everybody just left. It started out being substantive, right? It with these complaints against the leadership in Missouri that they were abusing authority and misusing or embezzling church funds for their own gains. Then when they made their way to Kirtland to stand trial, none of those initial 9 charges were brought up against them, and they spent the entire time bickering about who had what authority to charge who with what. This, over dramatic crock of dog shit not only distracted the leadership from running the church in, some kind of semblance of efficiency and beneficial way, but it also served to drive a huge wedge between the leaders that were willing to side with Joe against those who wouldn't and considered him like a fallen or false prophet. This is the direct effect of dissent in the upper ranks of the church. The thing is, with their disagreements here, there was no reconciling the difference. I mean, Defection Day in 1838 was an absolute necessity. Without Defection Day, the church never would have survived. And I've switched my opinion on that recently. I initially thought that Defection Day was, something that served to cripple the church forever. But no, it was a purge. It was a cleansing of the people that didn't believe in Joe. And it was an absolute necessity. So to really kind of highlight how tumultuous things were in the church, this is the next passage from the history of the church following the coverage of that council proceeding that we just read. Quote, at this time, the spirit of speculation in lands and property of all kinds, which was so prevalent throughout the whole nation, was taking deep root in the church. As the fruits of this spirit, evil surmisings, fault findings, disunion, dissension, and apostasy followed in quick succession, and it seemed as though all the powers of earth and hell were combining their influence in an especial manner to overthrow the church at once and make a final end. Other banking institutions refused the Kirtland Safety Society notes. The enemy abroad and apostates in our midst united in their schemes. Flour and provisions were turned towards other markets, and many became disaffected towards me, as though I were the sole cause of those very evils I was most strenuously striving against, and which were actually brought upon us by the brethren not giving heed to my counsel. Of course, this is all written from Joseph's perspective. No quorum in the church was entirely exempt from the influence of those false spirits who were striving against me for the mastery. Even some of the 12 were so far lost to their high and responsible calling as to begin to take sides secretly with the enemy. End quote. I think this perfectly describes everything that was wrong in the church at the time. It said, Joe said blatantly, it seemed like earth and hell were combining to basically overthrow the church. Everybody was getting wise to the Safety Society Company scheme and starting to refuse its money. People were refusing to sell things to the Mormons because the Mormons were buying everything with their own money, the Kirtland money that would have made better use if the people just wiped their own asses with it. This spirit of speculation was running rampant, even though Joe was strenuously striving against it. Although the argument can be made that he was responsible for the majority of this speculation, starting with the Safety Society Company. And to cap it all off, Joe said no quorum in the church was entirely exempt from the influence of those false spirits who were striving against me for the mastery. Even members of the 12 began to secretly take sides with the enemy. Now, last episode, I made the case that we saw a shift in Joe in the church. This shift had been a long time coming, so I wasn't surprised that it happened. I was merely surprised to see when it happened, because it happened so soon. The shift that I'm talking about was basically from the party boy no fucks given Joe to the mob boss Joseph Smith. And I believe that the foundation of the Kirtland Safety Society anti-banking company was our dead canary lying at the bottom of the coal mine here. Dissent was so powerful throughout the church that this court proceeding we just read through was held to determine by what authority the Missouri church was even operating, because they seemed so almost disconnected from everything that was going on in Kirtland. So let me just throw this out there. It's my naked opinion. I doubt there's really anything other than my own crazy musings to back this up. But I think that the Missouri Mormons were a different breed than the Kirtland Mormons. The Mormons in Missouri seemed almost like they were the real Mormons, while the ones in Kirtland, especially the leaders, were like the bureaucrats back at headquarters that didn't really know what it was like on the ground level. They didn't have a connection to what the Missouri Mormons were going through. To put it blatantly, the Missouri Mormons had been beaten and persecuted. They were chased out of their homes by mobs with torches and pitchforks. They were stolen from by the Missourians and the church leadership. They were ignored by Joe for various reasons. He didn't go out there and visit ever. And those reasons aren't really fully understood. I'm not sure why. Probably because the Missourians would probably mob against him and kill him. And then on top all of this off, all of this happened after these people had made the huge sacrifice of moving to Zion in the first place, having left behind all of their friends and their family and their possessions in New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, wherever they had moved from, right? A lot of these Mormons that moved to Missouri had left behind their farms and all of their accrued wealth over their lifetime, taking with them only what would fit in a wagon, just to go live in some instances on a communistic farm owned by Isaac Morley. We call this guy Yellerum Morley, a palindrome of his name, after the town that he founded in Illinois in 1840. It was a communistic town. Some of these people lived on Yellerum's farm in little tiny shacks, essentially as sharecroppers, giving all of their harvested crops to Yellerum to be sold at whatever price he could fetch, which at this time, he was probably being paid in Safety Society Company, monopoly money, meaning he was just giving away the crops and amassing wealth in banknotes that was more useful as fish wrap. My point is, the Missouri Mormons just had a tougher go than the Kirtland Mormons. Most of the Mormons living in Kirtland had experienced only a very subtle shift once Joe and Rigdon teamed up together in 1831, early 1831, late 1830, whenever that was. Rigdon was running his church much like Joe was before Joe got there, with the subtle change that Joe was slightly greedier than Rigdon. But Rigdon seemed like the guy with the big plans and the long-term ideas, and, the Kirtland members of his parish were accustomed to this since they began to follow him. That's just what they were adjusted to, and they had been following this long before Joe ever came along in 1831. Joe and, his special little Book of Mormon were just a new label by which these parishioners called themselves in the beginning. Of course, Rigdon and Joe seemed to kind of up the ante with each other, which was kind of weird, like betting on who can do some of the crazier shit, kind of creating this positive feedback loop of crazy shit that just got more fucking insane as time went on. But the Mormons in Kirtland didn't go through the same struggles as the Missouri Mormons went through. The Missouri Mormons had more grit, and I would argue that they believed in the fundamentals of Mormonism that the church in Kirtland was slowly being pulled away from as Rigdon and Joe kept coming up with new shit to try and make things more awesome, or try to make things maybe suck just a little bit less, right? What's more is, I think that the Missouri Mormons really didn't take to this major shift that happened last episode very well. Joe and Rigdon finally embodied and embraced the mob bosses that they've been leading up to for years now. And with the Kirtland Mormons, it's kind of like, like boiling a frog in hot water by slowly turning up the heat, right? The Kirtland Mormons were minimally opposed to what was happening because the heat was slowly being turned up on them. They were just adjusting to it as it was happening. But the Missouri Mormons were a different story. They were disconnected from all the crazy shit that was going on in Kirtland, and they were learning about these changes through like the Messenger and Advocate, or hearing about disciplinary councils of Missourian Mormon leaders for, something that they said or did at the pulpit, like we read just a little while ago, right? I mean, the Missouri Mormons seemed more fundamental and kind of like hardcore than the progressive version of Mormon that comprised the majority of the Kirtland Mormons. But, of course, that's just all my opinion, and it's how I see the narrative shaping up in my mind. Who knows? It's probably not worth anything, and it's probably not accurate whatsoever, and it's just the picture that I'm painting in my mind. But it seems to make a lot of sense to me. But to kind of shift focus here, do you want to know the most interesting part about the disciplinary hearing that we just read? Like, the most interesting part about it. Of course you do, but I bet nobody noticed it. This detail only occurred to me at the end of reading about this council. It took me coursing through pages of the history of the church surrounding this council to find something that was missing the whole time. This whole proceeding was called in reaction to dissent that was happening in Missouri, dissent and murmurings against the prophet Joseph Smith. The hearing was presided over by Sidney Rigdon and Oliver Cowdery, but where the fuck was Joe? These church leaders were standing trial because they were doing a small list of things against the prophet and his church, but the prophet wasn't even there to represent himself. I didn't notice that until the very end of the proceedings, and hopefully I'm not the only one that it took that long to occur to. But I think that's the most interesting part of this whole thing. Joe didn't even represent himself in the court proceedings that were being held to determine if the Whitmers and P. Cubed and Warren Parrish and all these other guys were being heretics against him and the church. Joe was nowhere to be found. His name was mentioned in passing once, but he wasn't presiding over the meeting, nor did he make any arguments. He just wasn't there. This episode, Joe was the vanishing man. Now, it took a fair amount of digging to find where Joe was at this time. And when I found the passage that I was looking for, I nearly shat myself in excitement. The best part about this is I'm not sure exactly what happened or how to interpret it, but the possibilities are just running rampant through my mind like a puppy in a bacon factory, because this passage is worded so ambiguously and it can be interpreted in so many ways. This is the passage that I'm referring to, and I can't wait to share it with you and, speculate on what it means. And it's taken from the autobiography of Wilford Woodruff, who was the fourth prophet of the church. Quote, April 13th, 1837, I married Phoebe W. Carter, daughter of Ezra and Sarah Carter of Scarborough, Maine. The ceremony was performed at the house of President Joseph Smith, Jr. Interesting. At the house of, not in the temple or anything. By Frederick G. Williams, Freddie G. Williams, Esquire. Interesting. Why was it performed by Frederick Williams when it was in the house of Joseph Smith, Jr.? The next line tells us, the prophet Joseph Smith, Jr. appointed to marry us, but his life was sought by a mob, and he had to flee. End quote. That was huge. His life was sought by a mob, and he had to flee. Joseph couldn't attend this council to determine if these people were heretics because he was in hiding from a mob that was trying to kill him. I have to be honest, right? Joe's life had been sought by mobs a small handful of times before now, but for the most part, we knew some of the people in the mob, and there was usually a direct motive behind it. And, take, for example, the mob that dragged Joe out of the Johnson home in Hiram, Ohio in, I think it was 1832, maybe 33. Members of the mob were two of the Johnson brothers that wanted to castrate Joe. We also know that Miranda Nancy Johnson, being 16 years old at the time, would later become one of Joe's wives. Now, by power of inference alone, there was a clear motive to that mob dragging Joe out into the dead, snowy night of winter in Ohio and beating him senseless before tarring and feathering him and almost cutting off his fucking balls. With that example, we have a clear set of circumstances leading up to the formation of the mob, and we can understand why they did what they did to Joe. We understand who was in the mob, and we can infer a motive behind it. So take another example of the mob forming in Colesville in 1830, right? They wanted to lynch Joe because A, he was preaching a false god, and B, he had swindled one of the beloved members of the community out of a fair amount of that man's hard-earned money, right? I'm talking about Joseph Knight Sr. here. And Joe was, instead of being lynched, he was arrested and then tried twice and acquitted on lack of jurisdiction and on the statute of limitations in 2 consecutive court proceedings. We knew who the mob was and who comprised the mob, and we know why they did what they did in that instance. Now, let's consider this mob that Woodruff told us chased Joe out of Kirtland at this very, very crucial time in history. Who were they? Why did they chase him out? What were their motives for doing so? Now, I have to admit, I'm at a loss for a definite answer here, but overflowing with speculations and wonder about the possibilities here. Every mob up to this point formed in reaction to very specific actions on Joe's part. But the problem now is Joe was doing so much underhanded shit and fucking over so many people that there's no way of nailing down exactly what the mob was pissed off about and who comprised the mob. I mean, let's ask some questions here, right? Was the mob just a bunch of investors of the Safety Society company that realized their money was worthless? Were they a gathering of people that had loaned goods and services to the church to whom the church had defaulted on payments? Were they members of Fanny Alger's family that were trying to kill Joe for the little sex scandal that had happened less than a year prior? Were they people that found out about another sex scandal that hasn't been popularized and is wholly unknown to history? Were they people that were unhappy with new church policies? I mean, for example, a chunk of text that I left out of this episode that I wanted to include, but it didn't for time's sake, was a disciplinary council that punished a guy named James Emmett for disobeying the word of wisdom, even though Bloody Brigham had purchased a tavern in March of that same year, only weeks before James Emmett was punished for a violation of the word of wisdom. I mean, were these people pissed off about Joe's interpretation of the word of wisdom and maybe the hypocrisy of Brigham owning his own tavern and selling strong drinks? I mean, were they just people that Joe had fucked over in some way that we aren't aware of? I mean, were they a bunch of people from other religious backgrounds that considered Mormons heretics and followers of a satanic cult? Were they just a bunch of Methodists that wanted to kill Joe? There's simply no way of knowing, because Joe had spread his bullshit so thick across so many places, covering so many people, that there was no longer just one small subsect of people that were mad at him about one specific thing. The question to ask that, I didn't ask in the last paragraph is possibly the most fun to, ponder and skepticize and mentally toy with to see what comes out. And this is possibly the biggest and most important question of all. What if that mob was made up of leaders of the church attempting a violent coup? God damn, just think about that for a minute. According to Bloody Brigham and others, the leadership wanted to kill Joe while he was in Salem 8 months prior to the time that we're talking about now. That happened before the Safety Society company was founded, before the Brother of Gideon Society, before everything that we've discussed in this episode, before the fraudulent investments and the dissolving of the Oliver Cowdery and Company printing press. Before all of that, the leaders of the church wanted to kill Joe. So it doesn't seem like any stretch of imagination to think that they may have tried to carry out an assassination and a coup d'etat from which Joe fled, and Rigdon, loyal to the end, represented Joe in this disciplinary council. This court that we discussed earlier, it's where they brought the primary actors under ecclesiastical punishment for their misconduct in Missouri, and the people that were also arguing that we should kill Joe while he was in Salem, Massachusetts. So they might have been people that were attempting a coup in early April, and who knows what else the people in this council argued about that just happens to escape the written record here. There's no way of knowing what they said. I mean, to be a fly on the wall in the room when they were discussing what had happened here. So let's run with this. Maybe, let's say it, that mob was trying to kill Joe, and they were attempting a coup d'etat. They were attempting to usurp his throne. Let's run with that here. What does that mean for the future of the church if the leadership was trying to remove Joe 7 years before his actual death in 1844? We're looking at 1837. There's still a lot more to go before Carthage shootout happens. How could things possibly go well after this? What does this say about the unity of the one true church if the division in leadership was so powerful that they were willing to kill Joseph Smith? And now, just like every mob boss since the beginning of secret combinations in history, right? Joe had to watch his fucking back, because somebody was always gunning for his seat at the head of the church. And I think this is the first real sign of this happening in the church's history. Now, while the motivations may be fuzzy because of the abundance of possibilities, and the actual members of the mob may seem like a mystery because so many people wanted Joe dead at this time, the only thing that matters is Joe was prevented from attending to his duties as prophet of the church because he was hiding from people that literally wanted to kill him. I'm not talking about the kind of literally where somebody says, "Oh, I ate so much, I'm going to literally explode," right? No, this is the real kind of literally where they literally wanted to shoot Joseph Smith with literal searing hot lead through his body literally multiple times and literally cut off his head and parade his literally decapitated corpse around the community, saying, "We finally literally killed the old devil Joe Smith." Now, that's a thought experiment, and I like playing with thought experiments like this just to contrast it to the reality and the history that we actually know, right? Now, who knows what actually happened with this mob? Who knows who they really were, who really chased Joe off, where he ran to? We don't know, right? But what if they would have succeeded, right? I'm pretty sure I've asked this on previous episodes, but what if they were able to kill him in 1837? What if they were somehow they caught him out, while he was conducting this wedding ceremony between Wilford Woodruff and his, to-be wife Phoebe? What if they caught him in his home, dragged him out into the streets, and fucking shot him? Of course, there's no way to know what would have happened for sure, but I think it's safe to say that the church would be drastically different than it is today. In some sense, but in another sense, I think we would still see the church's meteoric rise in membership that happened in, 1844 and 1845 after Joe really died. I just don't think it would have been relegated and confined to Utah and the surrounding territories, from 47 on. And I don't think Bloody Brigham would have played as much of a part in the formation of current-day Mormonism as he actually did in the history. This is hypothetical, so who knows, right? Nobody knows for sure, but so many of the specifically Mormon things that we see today simply wouldn't be a thing. The practice of polygamy never would have happened the way that it did. The temple ceremonies would have remained merely a foot washing and anointing ceremony. No handshakes, no garments, no crazy baker caps for the men and veils for the women. I mean, so much of church beliefs and rituals that we know today would never be a thing. But I think we've now passed a critical point in Joe's leadership. A very, very crucial point of no return here. By the time 1837 hits, if Joe died at any point after this, he dies as a martyr. Simple as that. He had enough of a following at this point that saw him as a true prophet of God, that no matter how he died, he was a martyr. I mean, in June, right after this, in June of 1837, Joe actually takes deathly ill with some kind of like horrible bug or something. And if he would have died, it would have been construed as, oh, he started to go astray as a prophet and the Lord saw it fit to take him from us before he led us astray or something. Or, somebody might even construe it, oh, well, he was poisoned by this and this person that tried to take over the church. Or, if Joe happened to like fall off a cliff or got hit by a runaway carriage, that was Satan's hand at work taking the prophet from the earth in an untimely moment. I mean, but if Joe dies by lynching or gunshot by a mob, he's a prophet and was martyred for his beliefs, making the church and the Book of Mormon incontrovertibly true by those that believe in it. At this point, the church was a monster that Joe had created, or some kind of demon like he had summoned from the pits of human depravity, and it was so much bigger than just Joe and the leadership. I mean, really, anybody could cut the head off of Joe, and like the mythical Hydra, the church would just grow more heads in his place. Now, speaking of that, actually, there was absolutely no shortage of heads that were trying to grow in place of Joe even before his death. I mean, obviously, the Whitmers were trying to usurp the throne and become heads of the Missouri church in Joe's place, right? And then we have Lyman White was involved in the possible usurpation, as was P. Q. Parley P. Pratt. Hinchpin Rigdon and Bloody Brigham were loyal to Joe for now, but that was tentative and would remain so only until Joe's death. John Bennett and James Strang would soon become members of the church. Arguably one of the very few people that was loyal to Joe after his death was the lovely mafia wife Emma. And she wasn't affiliated with the LDS church because she hated polygamy and hated Bloody Brigham even more. Every person I just now listed became a separate head of the Mormon Hydra after Joe was severed from the body of followers. The only thing missing for all of these people to divide off and make their own church was the death of Joseph Smith, which is a problem that would be solved relatively soon in our timeline. Now, I have to say, learning about just how much disagreement and infighting there was this early on in the church makes me wonder how the fuck Joe lasted until 1844. He was a crazy bastard since the early days of the church and only continued to get worse and worse as the years ticked by. How did it go on for so much longer than we've already discussed in the podcast up to this point? You think he would run out of shenanigans to pull. I simply don't understand. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm extremely fascinated by it, but I don't understand it. And maybe that's why researching Mormon history is so much fun, because I simply don't understand it. I'm learning and understanding more every episode that goes up, but my God, there's so much more that I don't even have the slightest comprehension of. Stuff that I don't know about. I guess that's the point, right? There's that line that believers use to chastise people like us Exmos that leave the church and then study it the way that the listeners of this show do. I mean, even just by listening to the many hours of monologues that try to hash out Mormon history, you right now as a listener are studying a condensed version of Mormon history. And there's an annoying line that TBMs use to almost shame those that study Mormonism after leaving the church. They say some kind of bullshit old trope, you can leave the church, but you can't leave it alone. You're goddamn right I can leave it, and you're even more goddamn right that I can't leave it alone. Why would I want to stop learning about something that can occupy years of research and still leave me baffled at every new piece of information I learn? We don't study Mormonism because, we think it might be true and we're just mystically drawn to it or something. We study it because the history is fucking awesome and way more insane than we could imagine. The truth of Mormonism is way more fantastical and preposterous than any so-called anti-Mormon author or researcher could imagine or fabricate. Now, when I talk to Mormons about problematic things in Mormon history and they shut down or argue about it, I just have to take a step back and understand what they're doing from an abstract perspective. They're actually getting angry at history. They don't like the progression of events through time because it doesn't fit inside their own simplistic narrative of the church they believe in. They are actually disagreeing with reality because that reality makes them uncomfortable. They can say stuff like, when you bring something up that's challenging, oh, you're just getting that from some anti-Mormon website, or, you can't trust everything you read on the internet or in those books that are written by anti-Mormons that fell away from the church. And the only thing that I can say to that is, if everything that we've learned in studying Mormon history up to this point is all an anti-Mormon lie, and none of it is true, then it represents the biggest conspiracy in all of human history. If everything we've ever read or discussed on this show is nothing but anti-Mormon lies, then it has required the most extensive and nefarious orchestration of document manufacturing, twisting of facts, and outright fabrication of some kind of alternate reality or matrix than has ever been committed in all written history. Now, who's making up these documents and creating the anti-Mormon narrative that we're studying? That can't be answered. Why are they making it up? That can't be answered. How is this, shadow society benefiting from manufacturing this false history? That can't be answered. So when you talk to a TBM and you discuss some things that may not conform to their understanding of the church, ask them those questions about this anti-Mormon conspiracy aimed at debunking their church, right? And when they happen to ask you that stupid old question of, why is it you can leave the church but can't leave it alone? The only proper answer to that question is, because it's fucking awesome. And you should try to learn about it for yourself.
Hey Bryce, you fucking rock, man. I had no idea that you needed more support from the show perspective, and so I'm going to start doing that. I've recommended your show to a number of people and had them start, and it's helped kind of solve the question on the issues of what's happening in their lives, and it's been a good instrument in leading them to the truth and stopping believing in that fucking cult that is destroying my wife's side of the family. So, man, I appreciate everything you're doing. You rock, Bryce. I'm going to become a Patreon, and I hope the future brings very much success to you and your family. Thank you.
And that's it for the historical portion of the show. If you'd like to send in a voicemail just like this person did, you can always call in at 864-625-3366 or 864-NAKED-MO and leave a voicemail talking about anything in the previous episodes or just something that you want to say about the show. It'd be greatly appreciated if anybody wants to do that. Before closing it up tonight, there was typically I want to wait for a bunch of listener mail to come in, listener stories to come in anyway, not listener mail, but listener stories. And this is one that just kind of jumped out at me, and I want to share this. And this is from, I'll just say from A, because I don't think the person wants to share exactly their identity or anything. So I'm just going to go with A. And what A said, it was a Facebook message. And he said, "Hi, Bryce. I really appreciate the show and would love to share my deconversion story with you sometime." And I'm going to have to take this person up on this sometime soon because this sounds fascinating. They said, "After hearing how you appreciate hearing new voices and this being my birthday, I decided to write in. I was scooped up, or however it happened, by the LDS adoption agency and given to my parents after a nominal fee of several $1,000s during the early 80s. I have two siblings, both sisters. This is where my story begins, with the lies. Not lies that I want to tell, lies that have been revealed to me after the fact and told with an assurance that I would toe the line. My middle sister knows she's adopted. and has been given full access to any adoption paperwork. I truly believe this is only because she is half Persian and half Latin American. She looked different, and so holding anything back would be dumb, and she asked a bunch of questions. For me, however, until this past summer, I've had zero information. They finally gave me a manila envelope. I have yet to open it. That's the grip this cult has on me. My youngest sister was a quote-unquote test tube baby because my dad can't have kids. She's never been told and yet graduated from BYU this spring. I'll kind of leave it here because it's tough bringing it all up. Thanks again for your hard work. Signed A. And I just want to say to that, what an absolute mindfuck, right? I think anybody that is listening can understand. You go through your entire life understanding that your parents are your parents, and then you have some sort of idea that maybe I might be adopted, and then they hand you a manila envelope after, years and years of not even asking the question, and you can't even open it. And I think it has something to do with the, this family-centric narrative that the church puts forth, right? Every member of the church tries to be this, this poster board cutout of the perfect family, especially people that are in leadership positions, bishops, stake presidents, whatever. They have to be the perfect family people, the perfect family man. And when there's trouble in the family, like inability to have kids or something, it's oftentimes something that they will, that they'll do to branch out and adopt somebody. And I think that's great, right? There are plenty of young children out there that need to be adopted. I think that's great if the LDS Family Services are putting people in homes that are in need of homes. That's great. I'm glad that they can do that. But the fact that the LDS Family Services probably profited a fair amount of money off of that is something disturbing and barely merits any mention. But the fact that you were placed in this family, and you had no choice of what your upbringing would be like. You had no choice of where you were going or the type of family you would be in, much less the religion that you would be involved in, as well as your sisters. You had absolutely no way to control that. It's not like children do anyway, but being, plucked, scooped up, I think you said, scooped up, or however it happened by the LDS adoption agency and given to my parents. After being scooped up and just plopped into this family, not understanding exactly what happened. Of course, you're probably young enough that it didn't, you have no memory of it. I can't imagine what that must be like to understand that, this is where the lies begin. Lies that have been revealed to me after the fact, and told with an assurance that I would toe the line. I can only sympathize with you, it sounds very, very traumatic to understand that everything that you've understood about your life is basically just a fabrication of what your life could have been if you would have, stayed with your previous family or whatever, with your biological family or with, whoever, whatever the case may be. I can't quite imagine what it must be like to go through this. And I'm going to get back to you, to see if we can get you on the show, because it sounds like you have quite a fascinating story to share. And I would like to hear more about this. This is where my story begins with the lies. I want to hear where you kind of set out this line of denomination of where your life is lies and where you've come to grips with this cult, and that this cult has had grip on you. And, how you've come to understand it now. I hope that, you having sent in a message like this, you are now understanding that the church indeed is bullshit, that you have nothing to worry about, and you can understand that from an objective perspective, that it doesn't have to have grips on you. It is bullshit, and you can go to sleep at night resting assured that you've left a cult. So, I hope to talk with you soon. That's a very compelling message, and I thank you very much for sharing as much as you did. That was very fascinating. And that's just one thing that I wanted to share. Of course, there's always more of them to share, and I'm always sending out feelers for people that want to share more. Please, if you would like to share your coming out story, I'm amassing more of these to do another listener-driven episode that'll be coming down the pike in a few months here. There's quite a few of them, and they're just fantastic, and I love every one of them I get. I don't take the time to reply to the majority of them. It's very challenging to do, but I read every single one of them. I can assure everybody that sends in a message, whether email or Facebook, I do read them, and they are compelling, and I really do enjoy it and appreciate you sending them in. So to A and to everybody else, please continue to send those in. I absolutely love them, and it's just great getting this level of feedback from people that are, consuming the show and people that are enjoying what's out there. So, thank you to everybody that sends in some form of feedback, as well as to the person that sent in the voicemail and anybody that does want to send in the voicemail. And, one more thing to talk about before shutting it down tonight, here, on the 28th through the 30th, so the day this episode comes out through the 30th, I will be in Salt Lake at the Sunstone Symposium, and it's going to be fantastic. It's just basically this huge gathering of Mormon history and believers and ex-believers that just gather together in this huge annual conference. And, a lot of the seminars and stuff that they do are basically, how can we understand this about Mormon history and still continue to believe in the church? I'm looking forward to going to some of those seminars and seeing just what they're saying to believers and see how they can reconcile their beliefs. And I'm taking a pocket recorder with me. There are oftentimes a fair amount of Mormon historians that frequent this symposium. I'm hoping to meet with a couple of authors there. If any of them do show up, I would love to meet with them. Maybe I'll be able to record a couple of minute conversation with them. Of course, when the episode goes up next Thursday, I will be talking with them and give everybody a report of what the symposium was like. And, I hope if anybody is attending, I hope to hear from you. I hope to see you. I hope to talk to you, maybe shake your hand, give you a hug, and maybe go for a drink out on Friday night. So I'm planning on going to the Porcupine Pub near the University of Utah campus. That's where the symposium is held, on the U of U campus. I'm going to be at the Porcupine Pub on Friday night there. Love to see some people there that are, going to the symposium, or maybe just somebody that wants to go out for a drink there on Friday night there. That would be fantastic. I'd love to meet up with some of you, shake your hands, hug you, so on and so forth. I'm a hugger, have to deal with it. And that will be at the Porcupine Pub at 7 o'clock on Friday, July 29th. For people that are listening in the backlog, I know this is really short notice, but yeah, July 29th, Friday, the Porcupine Pub next to the campus. I think it might be even on the campus. Going to be hanging out there. That's going to be a party. Also at 2:30 at the Bountiful Heights Church. It sounds like Jeremy Runnels is going to be speaking. I think they have an entry fee necessary to get in, but looks like I'm going to be attending that as well. And I might be able to meet Jeremy Runnels face to face and actually shake his hand. Get to meet him if anybody isn't aware of who Jeremy Runnels is. He's the author of the CES letter, a fantastic so-called anti-Mormon piece of literature. And he also recently posted up a video of his excommunication on Facebook and YouTube. Amazing stuff. He really shoved it to the disciplinary council he was being excommunicated from, basically. And it's a fantastic video. I think I've talked about it in the past, but by the end of it, he just says, I'm excommunicating this church from my life. This is a kangaroo court, and here's my resignation letter, and I expect my records to be off of the church or off the church records by whatever time. And it's amazing. Jeremy Runnels is a fantastic dude, so look forward to possibly meeting him, speaking with him one-on-one. And who knows, I might be able to record something with him too with my little pocket recorder. Kind of doubt it, but maybe. Who knows? We'll see. That was just one more thing to announce there. And at the time that this episode goes up, on the 28th, I'm actually going to probably be attending one of the seminars at the symposium. So I hope that I'm having a fun time at the time that this goes up, but we shall see. And, maybe I'll see some of you on Friday at the Porcupine Pub at 258 South, 1300 East in Salt Lake. Gonna be there on Friday night. So yeah, hope to see some of you there. And, that's it for this episode. I know I said that I was going to go under 3.5 hours, and 2 hours is pretty close to good enough. So with that, I have to say thank you so much to Demonista for running the Facebook page. We're getting close to the 1,000 like mark, so we'd love to get some more likes on there and just get over that milestone, that goal that we've been striving towards for 1.5 years now. Also want to thank Jason Camo for his music that's used in the show with permission. If you want to hear more of his music, go to aloststateofmind.com. Also want to thank Craig Keeling for providing the artwork for this show, as well as for the daughter podcast, the Glassbox Podcast. Be sure to check out his blog at weirdmormonshit.com, as well as the daughter show, the Glassbox Podcast, where we read possible source text for the Book of Mormon. I want to thank all of the patrons who support the show. There's just been this influx of support just hasn't slowed down, and it's just continually blowing my mind. You guys are so amazing. Thank you all so much for supporting the show on patreon.com. That's so awesome of all of you. If you want to rate the show on iTunes or your app of choice, be sure to do that. Give it a 5-star review. We love getting those in. And most of all, I want to thank you, the listener, for lending me your ear. I hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. Fuck that. Too much beer. It's going to be an editing nightmare.